Welcome to Civil Discourse, a podcast where participants are free to share their ideas, empathize with other perspectives, and who intend to advance to a better solution to fix a societal ill. We will focus on topics that are particularly complicated. In a time where information is from sources more opinionated than ever, our mission is to find solutions and goals to accelerate the nation's progress with cultural impunity. I'm your host, Todd Furniss. Welcome to today's episode of Civil Discourse, hosted by Todd Furniss. I'm Todd Furniss, and I'm joined today by Dean Fanelli. Before I get started with Dean, I want to just remind everybody we really appreciate your support, and I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. We welcome that, and we need it, and we appreciate the comments below and the opportunity to engage with you. Today we have Dean Fanelli. Dean is an interesting guy in that, for many reasons, but amongst others, he tackles the complicated issues around intellectual property as a lawyer, and he's also a venture capitalist. So he's got some different perspectives on the healthcare world. He also hosts a podcast that deals with politics, law, and life sciences. So, Dean, welcome to the program today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to join you.
And I just want to use an editorial note. We're ripping Dean away from what is likely a fun-filled vacation. So, Dean, thanks for stepping away from holiday for a moment.
It's my pleasure.
So, Dean, you have an interesting perspective. You went to school up in Philadelphia, and then you went to George Washington Law. How did you end up getting into? How did you decide to go into intellectual property law, and then ultimately you bridged into VC?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm from Philadelphia, and I was at Temple University getting my PhD in organic chemistry. And it's funny. It's one of those things where, a lot of people say, how did you jump from, getting a PhD to patent law? And it's not that big of a leap, actually. Being a scientist, you really have to love it. And it's really those little nuances that make the difference. And if you don't love it, you kind of miss those little nuances of whether it's temperature, pH, anything like those type of parameters in a lab, so I liked the science, but I didn't love it. And, I found patent law was a way to kind of bridge both things that I liked. I was always interested in, the law generally. So moved down to Washington, D.C., went to GW, and now I work as a patent attorney at Cooley LLP, and particularly with biotech and pharma companies. So I get to use my technical background to deal with scientists and the business development people. And I also am able to obviously apply my legal skills as it relates to drug approval, obtaining patents, and transactions amongst companies.
So that means you've been very, very busy in all likelihood, especially in the last couple of years. First of all, kudos, because Cooley is a great firm. And most people don't know this, but I'm a lawyer as well. And so I've known of Cooley for a very long time, and they've got a great reputation. So you joined a good firm there, but you've also done a lot of stuff on the VC side. How did you get into that?
Yeah, I had my own firm for a while, from 2009 to 2016. I had a firm called Fanelli. We did patent law in the biotech and pharma industries. We had offices in U.S. and in Berlin, Germany. So we did U.S. and European patent law. And at that time, we came across a client that was an emerging growth company. It was basically a science out of University of Virginia. We basically took that on as a type of contingency, where instead of just doing one project for the contingency, we met with the inventor. We started a company called Phasimune. We did all the IP, all the corporate work, set up the scientific advisory committee, and then wound up selling the company. So the shareholders were very happy and got kind of bitten by that bug. And we wound up, my partner at the law firm, Thomas Haag of Fanelli Haag, he and I, along with another colleague who's currently at Cozen O'Connor, John Shire, started originally what we wanted to call a VC fund, but not having that track record. We basically use it as a holding company to start new companies. And two of our companies that we started were Exerna, which is developing new lipid nanoparticle components, which are the delivery mechanism for the mRNA vaccines. And we started another company called C Reveal, doing precision oncology.
So you're tackling two big issues there. One is the issue of the day with mRNA technology, and then the other, which is oncology, which is, I'm sure you know, and others in our audience will know, is one of the largest sources of expense in the entire healthcare industry. We kind of lump those together with dialysis, broadly oncology, and then specifically in hospital stay or any form of hospitalization. So you're aiming at the right targets, I should say.
Yeah, thank you. It was kind of serendipitous. Both of these companies are spinouts. C-Reveal is a spinout of Harvard, and Excerna, the LNP company, is a spinout of George Mason and University of Pennsylvania. They kind of just came around. So with the LNP company, Excerna, that was certainly very serendipitous, especially with everything that's going on, obviously.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about mRNA, and because I think one of the questions I think is very timely at the moment is how that technology was advanced or was even leveraged for the pandemic. Talk about that a little bit, and then the intellectual property rights associated with that. I know one of the things that happened was Senator Steve Daines advanced the bill. He wrote the bill, sponsored it, and then advanced it so that the drug companies would be able to expedite manufacturing of drugs and without any risk. Did they get any intellectual property rights for that? Or you may not know the answer to that question. I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that, but I would guess, you probably heard these companies and the WHO have been talking about removing patent barriers to allow vaccines to be developed for developing countries. And, it's been really from the pharma side, a controversial issue because, we tend to look at patents as, a recipe to how to do things and how to make drugs. And certainly you have to provide adequate, written description to describe what you're doing. But a lot of the underlying technology is trade secrets and know-how. So, a lot of these bills that are being passed and these treaties that are being passed on the international level, or at least proposed, they try and address this issue, but it's being addressed at a very superficial level because, as I mentioned, a lot of that know-how and trade secret is just not out there. And if you can imagine, before the COVID-19 and before we talked about the virus, mRNA technology was really still in the lab. There were no drugs developed from mRNA, and the vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, and from Moderna were the first actual use of mRNA in technology that was basically put out to the public. So, we're seeing real-time development of a new technology that had never been tested, which I would imagine that's kind of making people, promoting the skepticism amongst people. But the underlying mRNA technology has been around for over 30 years. Drew Weissman and Katie Carrico. Katie Carrico is now with BioNTech, and Drew Weissman is at University of Pennsylvania. They developed this modified mRNA, which is in the mRNA that's in the vaccines, starting really in the 80s. So it's been around quite a bit of time. So we're seeing really proof of concept of a technology that's been developed over the last 3 decades.
So you raised in that one little bit, you managed to raise 3 incredibly complicated ideas. So one is the issue of and it's kind of an ethical and a moral question, which is how do you get drugs into developing nations? And that obviously you've got a moral concern about the health and well-being of people in those countries. At the same time, you've got a little bit of a slippery slope because that's analogous to what's happened in China and other countries characterized as developing nations with regard to other forms of technology. Then you have the second question, which is one of pragmatics around, a lot of this is know-how and getting it actually into the market or into the physical bodies of the individuals who are adversely affected or maybe adversely affected. And you got the third issue, which is the complexity of the technology itself. So let's kind of take those one at a time. Let's try and tackle the moral and ethical question. What's your perspective on that? How are drug companies handling that? Because on the one hand, they need to make money in order to fund the research, and on the other hand, they may not be able to charge the same prices in developing countries.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, that's a big issue in the United States. We hear a lot of people, in my opinion, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but you hear people saying the US basically funds other countries' healthcare because our healthcare expenses here are so expensive. And it is, rather frustrating when you see new drugs and biologics being developed that are, tens of thousands of dollars, oftentimes for per dose or annually. And you hear about stories about people that can't afford it. So especially older people that are on fixed income. So there's certainly an issue there. The drug companies do try to do a lot to get drugs to people that can't afford them. Certainly they have, in the US at least, that they have certain rebates. They'll offer drugs at a discount or provide coupons for people to even get drugs for free. Now, when we talk about that on the international level, it gets to be a little bit dicey because, especially, for example, you're talking about, recently with COVID-19 and the vaccines and these boosters. Now, we've heard a lot of debate about should the U.S. Citizens now be getting a third shot, a booster shot, when other countries a lot of their population haven't even gotten one. And certainly there's the moral issue. I think the U.S., as a world leader, as a global leader, we do have an obligation to get these drugs to other countries that are less fortunate. But certainly, at least in my opinion, when we look back at Operation Warp Speed that the Trump administration started with to get these vaccines where they are today, whether it was through R&D or supply agreements, a lot of U.S. taxpayer money went to the development of these vaccines, as well as, for example, Pfizer didn't take the R&D money, tax money, but they did take money in the supply agreements. So when you look at it from that perspective, I think the answer is we should do both. I think the U.S. has an obligation to provide vaccines to these countries, but I think we also have an obligation to make sure that our people are healthy. And I'm not of the opinion that, we should start sending vaccines abroad at the expense of U.S. citizens, especially when it looks like these booster shots are in fact necessary. So I think it's a balancing test. There's a lot of optics, but I think there is that obligation of the U.S. to work with these companies. Now, I don't think, when we go to the other issue that you had posed about the intellectual property underlying know-how, I think it's a big ask to ask these companies to give up their know-how and give up trade secrets to allow developing countries to build their own manufacturing capabilities, because this is not an easy thing to do, to develop these mRNA drugs. Even if you have a recipe, it took Pfizer and BioNTech, it took Moderna a while to kind of tweak the exact ingredients to get these going. And especially, when you're thinking about this on a commercial scale, large scale manufacturing, I think it's easier said than done to say we can build a facility, in a developing country and then they can make their own vaccine. I think a better strategy would be to work with the current developers to increase their manufacturing capacity and then use those to distribute vaccines. And we just heard, it was either yesterday or today, Vice President Harris is in Vietnam, and the U.S. promised that they would deliver 1 million doses to Vietnam. So I think there is that balancing between getting these vaccines to developing countries, as well as now that we know the data shows we likely need a third booster shot, especially in people, immunocompromised people, that we could also allow U.S. citizens to get that third shot.
So I think your analysis is spot on, and I think there are dynamic tensions you have to manage. Is there a way to have some sort of a moral or an ethical North Star, if you will, or a guidance? And I like to say that, in my view, judgment is the application of your values to the fact pattern before you to make a decision. So you get your values I get my values from scripture, from dining room table, and from other sources. And then I also get I learn how to apply those values for decision-making purposes through an apprenticeship model. So, that's the structure anyway that I think I use to think about the issues. What's the North Star then that guides how you think about these issues in foreign countries and developing countries specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a complicated question. I think, similar to what you said, and I commend you for those, because I think, in this country, when we look at the news, it seems like a lot more people should be just sitting around the table and, developing their own moral compass. But to answer your question, it just seems that, as a global leader, we see, for example, China and Russia, they were using the distribution of their vaccines, the Sinovac and the Sputnik vaccines, sort of in a diplomatic way to say, okay, if you let us do X in your country, we'll deliver doses. And I think that's the opposite, right? That's, kind of, the quid pro quo of give us something and we'll give you something. I think the US has to take an approach kind of, as you suggested, where we're not looking at this to say, hey, we're going to give you these vaccines and we want X in return. We're giving you these vaccines because it's the right thing to do, because a lot of these countries, we look at our own US Food and Drug Administration, and which in my opinion is the gold standard globally for drug approval. And most countries don't have a internal agency that approves drugs. They rely on the World Health Organization. That's why when we heard the World Health Organization say these, for example, AstraZeneca is approved, these third world countries develop on that. So I think close collaboration of the US with the World Health Organization, with other local organizations in specific countries, is the way to move this forward. And I think it should not be the type of thing where we're doing this with any expectation in return. I think we should do this, as a global leader, as a moral leader. We're trying to get this moral high road, so to speak, back in the US. Despite what we're seeing on the news about Afghanistan and all this harsh criticism that we hear on the news, I think the US ultimately is a very generous country. I think the people of the US will agree that, helping these other countries is our obligation. So I think morally, that should be the guiding principle, to get these to other countries because it's the right thing to do.
I think that's a noble approach, and I think you're right. It does give us an opportunity to try and inch back up to reclaim some moral high ground as a nation. We desperately need it for a whole bunch of reasons right now. But I think one of the things that you point out, which is not well understood especially by people who don't travel. I like to throw out a few fun facts around population sizes to give an order of magnitude. People talk about New Zealand, for example, as a country, and it is. But what people do not realize is that as a country, New Zealand has a population of about 3.5 million people, between 3.2 and 3.5 million, which means it's about half the size of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex where I currently live. So it can't afford the kind of administrative response that we have in the form of approving drugs and other things. It just can't afford it. So what people don't realize is that one of our leading exports, although people don't realize it, are things like regulations and approvals and sort of validations, if you will, of everything from foods to drugs to any number of other things. So the scale just doesn't work to the advantage of this small country. And when you hear about New Zealand, you then go over to Australia, which is about 22 million people, smaller than New York City. You go to Austria, it's about 8 million people. Switzerland, 7 million or so. Norway and Sweden, also in the 8 to 10 million range. Again, these are all small countries without the base of the population base to support the kind of administrative and approval structures that we have in the United States. So I think we can help a great deal by doing things properly here in the US and then leveraging those to the benefit of the world. We have to be thoughtful about it, of course, and I think your idea is spot on. Moving over to the mRNA technology, where I know you are not only just a curious lawyer, but also an investor. A friend of mine regarded this as what could be the Manhattan Project of our generation, meaning that they viewed the scientific breakthrough that underpins mRNA as so critical and so perhaps valuable to the future of us as a species, that it was really to be taken note of. Do you give it that much gravitas?
I I do. I look at mRNA technology and the validation of the technology through the manufacture and development of these vaccines as basically a proof of concept of the future of medicine. I mean, when you look at mRNA, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of mRNA has been around for several decades, and the underlying modifications and studying it in labs has been done for again decades. The problem with it was always this delivery, whether it's you're talking mRNA or other types of RNA technologies. How do we get this mRNA into cells to do what we think it can do? And with the development of these LNPs, although they're not perfect, they've gotten that in there. So we're seeing proof of concept of what could be, the future of medicine, basically getting mRNA to code for different proteins that are potentially defective and diseases associated with defections and defective proteins. You're seeing that in real time. So I do personally, I do believe mRNA is the future of medicine, but I have to, sometimes as an investor, just take a couple steps back. And the reality of it is again, this technology has been studied for decades, and only now are we seeing the application of it. So the application of this for infectious disease in the COVID-19 scenario, although it's promising, this certainly doesn't mean that this will be applicable to other technologies. I mean, the way the body works, we would think that it would be applicable, but certainly we have to be realistic. And any type of new mRNA technology, even though this technology has been tested and administered in billions of doses through the vaccine, will have to go through clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and will take a long time to get there. Again, we think about the development of these vaccines, and basically the genome was announced in January of 2020. We had a vaccine by December available to the public. That's just not how ordinarily the drug development works. We're talking decades. So, I think this is the future of technology, again, in my opinion, but we're probably looking at years before we see other applications of this mRNA technology because of the regulatory burdens that won't be as expedited as they were in the current situation.
So that raises another couple of questions. One is, and we delight, and just so you know, we delight in being wonky on this podcast. So just take refuge in that if you have a desire to be even wonkier than that. But we love these complicated issues, and it's a source for our viewers of unpacking some of this stuff. So I'm grateful that you have kind of the educational background and as well as the professional background to dive into some of this stuff. There are two issues that have come up that I am particularly interested in. I've seen reports from research physicians and others that express concern about mRNA for two reasons, and I'd love your perspective on this. One is that mRNA catalyzes or activates the autoimmune system, but the autoimmune system doesn't necessarily know how to turn off. That's a very simplistic way of describing it. So the concern is we don't know where to go from here, meaning as your autoimmune system, the autoimmune system doesn't know where to go from here after it's battled the COVID virus or whatever else it's targeted at. The second component of the question is, I've heard concerns expressed about particularly women of childbearing years because we are uncertain about what happens with the fetus if the woman is pregnant and gets vaccinated. I've seen reports that miscarriage can occur. The risk of miscarriage can increase from 10% to 80%. And I've also seen concerns expressed about male fertility and as well as female fertility if you get the vaccination prior to trying to conceive. Do you have a perspective on either of those two issues?
Yeah, they're great questions. And I think, certainly when you advance a new technology, people should be skeptical. I was skeptical, when I first started hearing the trials. I think There have been trials done in pregnant women and nursing women to confirm whether these are safe. Now, certainly, one of the issues that arises with these is all the data we have is short term.
Yes.
Typically, when you're talking about drug development, you're talking over the course of roughly 10 years, sometimes more, give or take. So there you have adequate time to, you do your phase 1 trial, phase 2 early on. You still have 5-8 years before, potentially you get drug approval. So you can analyze those people that have gotten it to see if there are any long-term effects. So in this case, because we're obviously in a pandemic situation, that time wasn't a luxury we had. So we had to get these vaccines out there without knowing, are there these long-term effects? Now, as I mentioned, there has been a trial in women that showed at least over the short term, there were no issues. There's a lot of anecdotal information out there where, you hear about someone who's gotten vaccinated and has either had a miscarriage or, without being insensitive, that there has to be a causal relationship, obviously, to show that could have just been something else. So I think these are valid concerns. Because we don't have that time, I can't say 100% these are safe. I could say based on the data, I believe they're safe. The mRNA that's delivered, the modified RNA, that stays in your body for about 24 hours, then it's gone. So it's not there very long. The LNPs, the lipid nanoparticles, which is the delivery system, that also could generate a potential autoimmune, an immune response. Anything you put in your body that's foreign will develop that. So these are concerns. So at this point, the answer I would say is I have not seen any definitive data that, in my opinion, I have a 10-year-old son. If the vaccine becomes available for him, to me, the risk of him getting the virus outweighs potential concerns. So I think people have to kind of make that risk-benefit analysis in their head. I mean, it's not by any means, no one should tell anyone, oh, don't worry, these are completely safe. We just don't have that data. But based on the data we do have, at least at this time, I think the vaccines are safe. Generally, the mRNA in these, we have seen side effects, but generally, I believe they are safe. And I think a lot of the information that's out there is more anecdotal than causal when it comes to pregnancy, when it comes to fertility.
So the fertility question arose because I know of the drugs that women were taking back in the 50s and early 60s to prevent miscarriages. And what happened was, a decade later, unfortunately, those mothers now had acutely deaf children. So you're right I think you're right on target with regard to the fact that the length of the longitudinal study isn't long enough, in essence, to really understand it. So it's harder to figure out and predict than we would like. But I understand the analysis, which is it appears to be okay right now, and we don't have enough data, and there's a pandemic raging that we need to focus on. I'm curious, though, with regard to your son, because it seems to me that children, particularly, and I'm using the term children to refer to anybody under 12, are really unlikely to have any severe or acute problems from getting either COVID, the Alpha variant, or the Delta variant. And they would likely develop antibodies as a result of getting it. So if your choice is get the vaccination and have a remedy that's useful for 12 to 24 or maybe more months, or alternatively get the disease and then have the antibodies, which we don't even know when they run out. Which would you prefer? How do you do that analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a question that's personal to every parent. And certainly I would never tell someone else, you need to get your kid vaccinated. It's a personal decision. When I weigh the facts in my mind, it comes out to, I would get my son vaccinated. I think, we're hearing obviously a lot about Delta variant. There probably, in my opinion, will, before we get this under control on a global scale, be other variants that are out there that potentially could be equivalent in transmissibility and maybe even more lethal than Delta. But taking a couple steps back, some of the things that we talk a lot about the vaccine, and we don't know a lot about the vaccine. But what's also true is we don't know a lot about the virus. And, we're hearing about these long-term effects that people are having, relatively healthy people, and there's a basis for that. When you think about, women that get papillomavirus, they have a higher risk for cervical cancer. When you think about people that have actually gotten chickenpox, they have a higher level or a higher risk of getting shingles when they're older. So it's not completely out of the norm to say, hey, if you get a virus, there could be long-term complications. And we are hearing that. So when I look at the science behind the mRNA, when I look at my son, when I look at the potential long-term risks, and when we look at the fact that, because of the Delta variant, the number of cases in children does seem to be going up. The number of hospitalizations does seem to be going up, although I agree with you, certainly not to the level that we saw in adults. But when I weigh all those variables, that's where I come out in saying that I would probably have my son vaccinated. The fact that there could be these long-term effects. We are seeing higher transmissibility amongst children, and no one wants to be that, person that just digs their heels in and says, hey, this is not for my kid. And then God forbid something happens to your kid. So that's kind of how I come to the conclusion that, at least for me, it's a personal decision that I would say I would allow my son to get the vaccine.
You did an excellent job of framing the analysis. I appreciate that. And I think it's especially interesting coming from a venture capital guy, because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is what's our tolerance for risk. And whether you're an investor or a medical expert or a policymaker, or just an individual trying to make good decisions for yourself and your family, at the end of the day, it all comes down to risk. And so there's a legal question that I've been bouncing around for a while, and my, kind of tapping into other aspects of your very capable training. The way I look at this is there's a dynamic tension that this nation's been wrestling with since inception, which is the dynamic tension between the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective. And what I like to say is that historically, under common law, we generally said that the rights of the individual prevail unless there's a compelling public policy reason for doing so. And that usually correlates to something called a material risk, which I normally use as a rule of thumb of 5% number. So as a result, if you use that analysis, one could conclude that there's not a material risk because the threat of death for COVID is about 1.2, 1.3%. The threat of death for kids is lower than that, and the threat of death from the Delta variant, especially if you have been vaccinated, is about 0.0007%. So, is my analysis off in your regard, or do you see it differently?
No, I think when you look at the numbers, I think, those numbers are all factually correct. I don't disagree. And that's why we're in really a situation that we've never been in, right? When people, the facts you just presented are valid facts, and, looking at that statistically, there's probably, at least I'll talk personally for my son, there's a very, very low risk. So whether you draw the line at a specific number, like you mentioned, 5% of where, that risk tolerance is, or in my case, a lower number, I just come at it from the perspective of, the potential long-term risks. I don't want to be, put my son at jeopardy, of getting the virus, of potential long-term risks. But, again, it's a personal decision, and I don't dispute any of those facts. And, if a parent wants to say, hey, the risk of this is under 1%, so be it. But that risk to me is still not something I'm willing to take. So it's just a matter of, where you draw that risk threshold, I think.
I think you're exactly right. And I appreciate your signaling the idea that it's such a personal decision. I think we all have this challenge, and we want the best for our country, we want the best for our community, we want the best for our family, and we want the best for ourselves. And this is not an easy thorn-free conversation or a thorn-free issue to navigate. As we've seen our nation really struggle with it in so many ways, and I think it's the reason for some of the deep divisions we see in the politics of this all. But hopefully we can move to a better place. Dean, I cannot thank you enough. What a rich conversation this has been, and I'm so grateful that you have invested your time and treasure to be so well educated on so many different complicated disciplines. It's been fun to have you, and I'd love to have you again. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I'd love to join you again, and thank you for bringing these issues out into the public. I think it's really important because, again, I think a lot of what we hear on the news, it comes across as finger pointing, and people, no one likes to be told what to do. So I really appreciate the fact that you bring these factual issues out and present these facts to allow people, to make their own decisions. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of Civil Discourse. To learn more about today's topic or our guest, visit www.the60percentsolution.com or www.tfip.group.